So let's examine these traits of Bolshevism, which are overlooked in our history books that have unfortunately taken an ever more materialistic direction, have made you think that essentially the competition between East and West is just a matter of, how many dishwashers you make, or how many cars you reproduce, or things like these, and have habituated also the conservative to reason in those terms that are paradoxically of Marxist derivation. So there are many interesting aspects of this. This video is purely, ad hoc for the occasion, if you see the date. And we will talk at some point, hopefully, at least on each of these aspects and of the history of the Soviet Union, which is really important, but that assumes this, character of primary importance in the measure its legacy is weaponized, politically speaking, and of course mostly in the cases that we have witnessed for local self-consumption, right? But still, for many people out there to be at this point in history completely disoriented on any educational, moral, scientific, or cultural ground, not to understand for what it is. So there is one trait, first of all, that has to do with this channel about the Bolshevik Revolution per se, that differently from other revolutions, didn't own its kind of a romantic, stormy or chaotic or irrational overtone that characterize all revolutions. If you look at the French one, for example. This is not to say that the, let's leave aside properly the Russian revolution, let's talk about properly the Bolshevik one, that as also the term says, was not to happen forcibly, deterministically, right? If the Germans hadn't sent back to Russia Lenin and the armored train, or like even during the Russian Civil War, that the Bolsheviks at some point properly lost control of their forces. They couldn't believe themselves that they made it in the end, and it lasted for long at that point. But it's the political direction, right? It has to do, as a matter of fact, with the Clausewitzian culture of Lenin himself, who intelligently planned and well executed the whole affair, in spite of the actual connection. But it's obvious that without Lenin's leadership, the Civil War would have failed in the first place, and also kind of independently from him in a sense, because again, there were broader international and local factors that could have taken completely other turns, as we were saying. But it is important here to look at the way Lenin himself studied the proletarian revolution, like literally a mathematician dealing with a complex calculus problem, right? Analyzing it in a detached, lucid way in all of its details, right? He was a strategic mind, as he was educated in the Clausewitzian theory. And he famously said at some point, quote, "Martyrs and heroes are not necessary to the cause of the revolution. What the revolution needs is sound logic and an iron hand. Our task is not to lower the revolution to the level of the amateur, but to transform the amateur into a revolutionary," right? And the idea here was unlocking the fourth state, the masses, right? The furious, uncontrolled, and by a certain degree uncontrollable element that, however, could fuel, let's say, even with all its extremely low quality, but still quantity, and this were recurring very often, properly in Soviet history, like a leitmotif, to get properly to the point. It was a purely abstract one that, in fact, collapsed, and how it collapsed, right? It's difficult to find historically. I mean, at some levels, you can't even believe how, for example, every single, and of the magnitude of the Soviet style economical policy failed in the Soviet Union. That's something appalling if it was just for that. But when abstract ideologies meet reality, eventually the system collapsed. You would have to explain now why it lasted so long. The counterpart to the Leninist principle, as you know, was Trotskyism, which instead saw the coup fundamentally not as much a problem with the masses, but something much more, let's say, specialized, right, with the employment of very well trained and ad hoc, directed teams that would have to dispose of the situation in a very surgical fashion. And you know how the thing ended, right? And this counter view, of course, was necessarily acquired eventually by the Soviets, as you know, because, with, banally speaking, with collectivization, the Soviets killed, they didn't really kill them themselves, they simply made them starve to death as a consequence. More people than in Russia than the entire World War had done, just because they applicated, without any concern for any kind of reality, communist economical regime, to a system that immediately collapsed, and people began literally to starve to death. And they had to stop this now, right? And so the necessary privatization of some industries and banks, etc., that Trotsky advocated, eventually was necessarily, after his death, taken by Stalin, which, at that point could have never ruled over, even his house, if he had, continued to apply those economical theories. Now, so there is, in this sense, something atrocious, that is the ruthless ideological coherence of the Bolshevik Revolution. Coherence doesn't mean rationality, doesn't mean morality or scientificity. It just means coherence. It is a logic for the sake of itself. In a totally materialistic, anti-spiritual, dispersonalized fashion, the leaders of the revolution didn't have any interest in any practical consequence of the revolution itself. The enormous disasters, the collapse, basically, of the entire system that derived from the application of their abstract principles, right? To them, mankind, let's say, especially men, right, the human as such, didn't have any meaning of the slightest kind. There is just, this handful of people that are concentrating their fanatism in this exact logic, method, and focus with the only mental horizon that just a technician would have, just for in a mechanistic sense, nothing else, right? The rest didn't count. It was not properly accounted. It didn't have to account, but it was properly not taken in consideration because to them it did not exist. First of all, like it's not that it must not, didn't have to exist. It did not exist. This is the point. And only in a second phase. So this was to just achieve power, and then during the war to maintain it. Right after the Civil War was over, the same people, within the pre-established notion, began what we know as the totalitarian regime of terror that was aimed at frantically extirpating whatever had been connected to the ruling class, right, and drawing the masses into the complete and most abject emptiness, appalling moral material misery, terror, paranoia, distrust, complete ignorance, isolating everybody from the world. This you would ask how it was possible, because you see, the regime eventually collapsed, and it collapsed after quite a while, and it collapsed mostly because of the Warsaw Pact countries, and that were historically more advanced and kind of a more individually more aware of the concept of individual superiority. I mean, Poland or Czechoslovakia were not Russia historically. But what is fascinating about this is that in most revolutions you have, given properly the demonic, and therefore blind, obscure, unregulated, disconnected mentality of fanatism, you have properly the revolution devouring its own children, right? This in Russia factually did not happen, right? It happened, of course, to a small degree. There were some people who were taken out without any, the minimal, regard for anything, like including humanity. But it's just, as we've seen, it does not exist in this scenario. Somebody who went, of course, outside the orthodox trajectory in some ways, would be removed. But if you look at how the regime was established and how it remained until the dissolution, you don't actually see any relevant crisis or oscillation. And in the moment it happened, it crumbled altogether. What was terrifying about the Soviet Union also how quickly it collapsed. And of course there is an osmotic process for which you cannot hide reality to a human being. And this is naturally what basically the whole communist ideology instead is founded on, and doomed for that matter. But in a world that basically had remained into the Middle Ages up to the century before, of a few generations, this thing, and especially in the very specific Eastern European context of properly the utter subhumanization of the masses, has it always historically been there, since especially the Mongol conquest that radically informed the Tsarist political culture, that was very different from what had been in the Kievan Rus, etc. This could be achieved because the masses fundamentally had never had anything. They didn't know anything about the war. They didn't properly have it's not. The masses are always rebellious. They had always been prevented, let's say, from being armed. You have mass warfare, First World War, you arm the masses, you have a revolution. That is the thing. The problem is, what do you do with that freedom? And so we're not going to talk about the options that could have existed, and more fortunately in the world from a liberal Russia, for example, if the Bolsheviks had not taken over other issues, but this is a completely different thing. And this is a deeply sinister trait, because you see, there was no opposition to the regime, right? This is the point. At least, any opposition was removed. It was a war. It was removed. But after that, as is in any other regime, authoritarian, dictatorial, totalitarian, the fault is never, like, it was that guy's fault. It was the dictator, right? It's a responsibility. The fault is, of course, of the entire people, right? If you live in any of the country, you are, in your part, directly responsible for whoever is at the top. Always. It's a myth to presume that, I don't know, the Italians were not responsible for fascism, or the Germans were not responsible for Nazism, or the Russians were not responsible for communism. They all were, right? What is terrifying is that in the Soviet Union, the direction towards which the effort had to be directed was not human, was not based on an improvement of the individual, of any human ground. It was the complete opposite, right? Nazism was pointing at that cultural development. You can stress rightfully the uniqueness of a national socialist evil when you realize how a developed country could eliminate an entire people based on an alleged racial discrimination basically perfectly, industrially well organized, efficiently, and everything, and say, wow, this is what civilization can create. But at home, the people, albeit, as in all these totalitarian, nationalist, statalist, socialist regimes, were just, fueled by the fourth state, by the lowest elements of the masses that were, channeled, instrumentalized in this sense. At least the individual was exalted, was meant to elevate himself, to cultivate himself, to develop, right, in the wrong direction, but there was a human base, right? So if you think about what happened, this is not just about the Soviet Union, this is largely in communism altogether. It was towards the complete opposite, so that you should probably start even to reconsider whether, I personally don't appreciate this sense of the scale of evil, right? But there is something sinister, at least, that in the world has been completely obscured, and surely because of the Marxist cultural prevalence after what we were saying about properly the abomination in the dignity of mankind that the sole idea of communism represents. I mean, I presume that if you are not morally or materially disadvantaged or poorly upbrought or individually frustrated, you cannot be a communist, right? This is the idea that, active, like, florid people cannot buy into this lunacy, right? They can buy into different lunacies, but the communist one is, in this sense, the lowest in scale. If you look at where it was nurtured, and especially for the reasons that it was nurtured. And we are paying, of course, for this, right? These things, first of all, this is what we have to remember. Do not come out for no reason, right? Even if, as we were just saying, of course, you cannot predict politics altogether, but still there are real causes that bring these things to happen. But especially, these things do not just stop and then you're a normal people or a normal country afterwards. It doesn't work like that. This is valid for every country in the world, right? What happened in the centuries before, even in millennia before, it doesn't actually go away, like in the sense you go to school and you change people. It doesn't work like that. There is something primordial, innate, right, that is, of course, logically and rationally explainable, but that in this sense, in the measure in which, of course, it shows an appalling reality, it makes it more difficult for a moral quality to elevate further the value of that context historically. So that it's normal that certain countries are more or less developed. And this comes in parallel with properly that level of moral or scientific capacity in the first place. So the in every revolution, normally you have this substitution, this idea of somebody else comes to power after there are problems. This thing didn't happen. The establishment was there. It was kept basically from the beginning to the end for the way it was, right? Which makes it terrible in inside, because it shows you how demonically lucid the intent was, right? What was the intellect, the method, and the will behind that, and how the people let it happen. And you can debate on the context and why this happened, of course. And we're not saying that when we talk about totalitarianism, we don't appreciate, let's say, anything of what a country would do, right? There were some great things, after all, that were done by these countries. I mean, if you think about, I don't know, German architecture, engineering, or Italian or Soviet archaeology, or these things, but let's say that those were big, important things that we still study on. But here we're talking about the moral principle that drove the whole system, that cannot make up for anything that was done by such regimes, because it properly it informed the entire, it was the spirit, the pneuma of the whole system. And it was acting on, on that behalf, to that purpose. And this is especially true in a much more properly authoritarian, habituated mindset like the one that the Bolsheviks found fertile soil for carrying out their own crime. Now, this problem lays, as we were saying, at the roots properly of the communist ideology, right? And in communism, according to communism at least, there are two truths that already tell you what communism is about, given that truth is only one by definition. So the first is what we could call an esoteric truth, right? This has a dogmatic and thus immutable character. Basically corresponds to the basis of the revolution formulated in the scriptures in the direction of the early Bolshevik period. The second one is like what you see very often, even in certain, post-socialist realities, this changeable, mutable, morally relativistic, and in fact, so-called by them realistic truth, right? That is also truth doesn't have qualifications, otherwise it's not truth. That is not surprisingly forged case by case, right? Not just in, of course, the Soviets were properly indoctrinated to lie to themselves on a regular basis, right? This was the most powerful mean they had properly to cope with reality, because if you don't believe in that absolute, and if you don't learn to lie to yourself in that regard, you cannot even cope with the most elementary reality, and remaining, of course there were other issues, that is to say, like in World War II, we're told we will be, we were fighting against annihilation or something. They didn't give a damn about the fact that, whatever the purpose was. Of course, these people wanted just to save their own skins. But this realistic truth is basically, characterized by a sort of compromise, after all, with the idea of the bourgeoisie, right? For example, the patriotic idea, right? When the Russians celebrate the end of World War II, oddly enough, they don't celebrate one of the most severe anti-liberal repressions with thousands and thousands of deported people just after the war, because they had awaited for that point for a liberalization that never came, right? Or the mitigation in the collectivization of private property that, of course, happened with the Trotskyist legacy in Stalinian regime. The pan-Slavic myth, right? So even here, insufflating into the lowest instincts of completely uncultured masses, by the way, and so on. So the varieties of the second type of truth are put aside immediately as soon as they have achieved their contingental objective, right? They're mere instruments to fool people, of course, to remain servilely obedient to the first truth, right? One last effort. This was in every socialist regime. Yes, you live like shit, but this is just the last effort, right? Just make another. Yet I don't know if any of you has, in your family, etc., has visited a what is at the time a socialist country, and what they found there, because I can assure you that, I mostly go by. I have an enormous bibliography about the Soviet history. I got interested in it, but sometimes just even what people saw there is eloquent. And at some point I will tell, and the most frightening part is that, of course, this was in the moment in which for them was kind of normal. The situation was kind of fine. And that's exactly what they were forced to believe, right? And in part, of course, was lying to themselves, as always, as a default, mode, right, which you find, in fact, still a standard in these countries. Like, you would think that, I don't know, these peoples are still gullible. They're not gullible at all. They are distrustful and traumatized and paranoid by default. That is, they don't trust not even their politicians anymore. Do you think that you ask an average Russian or Ukrainian what is going on? I mean, for which reason? Do you think that they know on average? They were not told, right? This is the problem. So this is something that goes beyond any national idea. This is not like an anti-Russian or pro-Ukrainian video per se, meaning that, of course, you understand that I'm making this for, but and you know that I'm not neutral, and you know that, however, but this is a universal thing, right? There are not just many Russians in Ukraine now that are fighting for their own country, but many Russians in Russia right now, in the hundreds, that are being arrested and to remain like there, who knows how long, because they're protesting against what Russia is doing. But the problem is that you cannot hope that this is enough, right? That wishful thinking, in the measure in which they were told at the time, just they're told today, is not enough, right? If you don't acquire an awareness about what is going on in a concrete sense, you can't change it, right? And it will be a useless sacrifice, like basically the entire history of the Soviet Union was. It was like Mao's China is surely the first, but the Soviet Union come easily second as the greatest use, in terms of probably of uselessness, effort in the history of mankind. People that have, tens of millions of people have been massacred, first of all, but properly hundreds of millions of people that have lived in the most despicable qualitative condition for nothing. Nothing. Entire lives completely lost to nothing of an entire country, and more of many peoples that have worked, fought, and died, and spent a lifetime of tears and blood for nothing, because they were nothing. This is the point. In the Soviet Union, humans as such did not exist. Equality was in nothingness, in the mere instrumentalization to an abstract principle devoid of any humanity that now we're looking at. So those who fall within the trap, believing that Bolshevism is a thing of the past, right? That it just evolved, right? It took different forms of government, and international relations, and these things are just a normalizing process of a country was trying to to progress and to liberalize and modernize, are terribly naive, to say the least. Not just disgustingly and grossly undereducated, but that's another problem, but properly in the, there's properly, in fact, no understanding of in a broader historical dimension of what we're even talking about. This is not even about the Soviet Union. This is about properly the formulation of evil in its most perfect definition, in an anti-human sense, in a human sense. And even about the so-called first truth, we cannot fool ourselves, because if you look at the Marxist economic myth, in fact, this is not the primary element of it, right? That's what they have made you believe. It's an entire distraction, essentially, to make you believe that if you have just certain socioeconomical, properly material status, everything is going to be fine. This is something that's being embraced also by the West in a certain degree, right? This is not part just of Marxism or communism. This has to do properly with a generalized collapse of the moral standards in the world, right? Due to dynamics that we explain in a secular, if not millenary sense, and that we will come back even more often now than the usual. So the primary element, right, of Bolshevism, and this is the single most important thing, is the disavowal of every, and I mean every, spiritual and transcendental value. So when we look at historical materialism from a philosophical, sociological point of view, this is just expressions of such disavowal and derive from it. They're not the other way around, right? Just okay, and the corresponding communist practice is but one, in fact, of the many methods that are systematically employed to carry it out. It doesn't stand within communism itself, also because communism does not exist, right? It's on the realm of our physical understanding of reality. It's impossible to attain communism. It's not impossible to attain because it was never politically or socially experimentable. It doesn't belong to the realm of physical reality. You cannot have what communism pretends to achieve, because it goes beyond humanity itself. In fact, it does not consider humanity at all. This is the point. And how do you achieve this? Of course, in the communist mentality, you see as the fundamental goal the elimination in the individual of any personal autonomous value, right? That is, if it doesn't represent an interest related to the needs of collectivity, that must be removed completely at all, right? So there was a process of mechanization, right? The idea that the individual is not just somebody that makes the community work, right? But the individual is made work by the community. This intellectualization, that is to say, you must basically not learn anything, because everything is useless, right? Let's not point. A rationalization, properly in a rationalistic idea, that is the enforcement of the idea that everything that belongs to your own ambition, for example, is mechanically removed, is properly aborted violently at every level, right? These are means employed to the end, and not, let's say, a simple, like you can complain, I don't know, like this is the difference from a communist reality and a dignified world. It's properly that in the rest of the world, the person has a, kind of a choice in all of this. These events, the mechanization, the disintellectualization, the rationalization of everything, let's say, is just up to free, right, decision, right? In the communist world, you are forced to have them eradicated, in case necessary, also together with your life in the process. So this is the myth, right? It's the collective level, which is strongly materialistic, is based on an economic delusion, mostly coming from the Marxian theory, of course, where it's the machine rather, right? So what fundamentally serves the purpose for everybody, not people that serve the purpose, right, in order to, to help each other, but becomes the center of the a new messianic promise, right? That is, however devoid of any spiritual value in everything. There is, right, this false idea of rationalization is just a way essentially to cut to pieces any reason and logic, right? To say there is an absolute reason and whatever you have to think, it doesn't matter. So that you, not only that, but if you do, you'll be taken out, right, as a residuus of a bourgeois degeneration, and therefore as an enemy of the people. So in the Soviet Union, as you know, the abolition of private property and enterprise is in the core exists in the core doctrines of communism. Beyond various contingent accommodations were present in the Union, right? And even this is just a mean to an end, right? Because through collectivism, the objective is to attain, paradoxically, a radical materialism in every domain, right? You become dependent on the means, right, as they are materially conceived, because you don't exist to make them work, to invent them, to produce them, etc., to as a mean to an end, but they exist to make you work. That's the psychological, the only mental perspective that exists on this. You don't have. I remember I had teachers of professors of economy that after the end of the Soviet Union had to go to Russia to teach people properly what is the concept of free market. Right, the idea that you have to produce because there is a demand and an offer. These people didn't know what it was. Right, it's not that they said, like, I know it, but it's wrong. No, they didn't know it existed as a concept. These people didn't think as a concept. That's what they were prohibited to speak to any tourist, that a shop assistant could own a car. It's not that they loathed that in a moral sense. They didn't know. They were prevented from knowing that it existed. This is how you damage the dignity of mankind. Just with a lie. Right? And so, the economical myth, of course, because they were told that, of course, the rest of the world existed, but was evil and corrupted, because it didn't reason like they did. But, of course, they didn't know anything of what they even thought, or what there was even outside of the world. And this doesn't just stop by literally precluding knowledge. This is also indoctrinating somebody to the point that maybe if you're briefly exposed to it, they don't believe it. They think there is something beyond that is, it doesn't exist. This is, of course, this is like an autoimmune disease more than else. And it's no surprise that actually such psychiatric conditions are dramatically way above average in post-socialist countries than in any other country. And this is the typical of the communist idea, that the regard of I, right, you are, because you have a soul and you can do things, is a bourgeois illusion and prejudice, right? It's like a fixed idea to demonize. It's inherently evil, pictured as inherently evil in itself. It's not even, of course, explained. It's not showed. Because if you don't have anything, how can you properly even train yourself to think in that sense? To get yourself habituated to the complexity of reality, you remain fundamentally a child, a mentally underdeveloped person, right? Just to be sent into the work, right? This is like we look at with communism, but it was identical to to what the communists did in this sense to workers and industries was exactly the same of what Nazis did to Jews, right? If you look at interviews on the Holocaust, they tell you something terrible. The survivors explain you how, they knew they were being sent to gas chambers, but it's not that they feared to escape, but they couldn't because they had a gun pointed at them. They were okay with that, because in the way they had been treated, they had deprived literally of everything. They would learn to obey that quickly. And that's how it was done in the Soviet Union as well, right? And it's very interesting to study it because, great things were achieved even in this sense, right? With an appallingly dramatic waste of energies, of lives. There's no doubt of this, but let's say these people were ideal to be taken and used as slaves to do essentially whatever you wanted. So this idea that you can have a soul, you can have something on your own, you can be a free individual, this concept was seen as the principle of all evil and disorder. That is, any concept of moral responsibility, of moral or properly scientific appreciation, stemming from individuality, was forbidden, right? The substitute was, of course, an adequate, realistic, whatever the hell that like. How, I don't know if you're acquainted to certain realities. How often in language the term realistic, right? I'm a realist. Counts back in this here, and of course at all levels, like from schools, right? By the 50s, it was already something. If like. 1/3 of the children went to school, for that matter. Under Khrushchev, you had properly, university professors were sent to harvest potatoes because they had to learn what that meant. Like, you can imagine the high quality of the teaching. And of course, everything was framed rigidly and exclusively and invariably and in the Marxist-Leninist doctrine, right? There was nothing else. There cannot be anything else outside of that, by definition. And the worst is that you do not know that there is anything else, because you're a person without any past and without any future. The work has been accomplished. You are nothing. You are basically the lowest degree of human possible in that, because you have been engineered as such from a mental point of view. This is how basically, and this was justified, by the way, in the sense that communism had criticized historically certain trends that had already unhinged because of mass society, etc. The West, in this case, from let's say a real understanding of the world that is properly individualism, libertarianism, humanism, or romanticism, in the sense of something understood properly in a ism sense that insisted on something that was increasingly detached from reality, and that we're ever more living on, as you understand, even in the age of social networks, a long process. And communism, in this sense, found a fertile soil because it was evidencing these dynamics as the irreversible, let's say, evil, right, of a world. That is something said much more complex than that can be countered exactly with the diametrically opposed means that communism was proposing to use. There's a famous saying by Zinoviev that said, "In every intellectual I see an enemy of the Soviet power." Right, and this is what essentially got down to. So also art, as you know, cinema. Like, if you, I don't know, I'm fond of Soviet cinema, for example, and all the history that lays beyond it. But it's properly the idea that art is for the use of the masses without basically any hint at psychology per se, right? The idea in the Soviet Union that there could be such, trivial things like private concerns of single individuals had to be eradicated, right? This is the idea that properly nobody had to be shown anything of what could be possible otherwise. It had just to represent this solely materialistic reality without any ambition in the individual. Of course, the representation of what it was like essentially to live before, nothing else, and also mocking for, of course, what had been the reminiscence of the past, because in the first generations people remembered how the world was before the regime, of course. It's not that Tsarist Russia was that happy of a treat, but let's say surely it was something else, and it had much greater potential to transform in something definitely different from what happened in a positive sense. So in this sense, art was serving a depersonalizing aim to spur, like a powerful hammer, right? The working class to action. These were the words were used at the time, right? And the most beautiful, beautiful, I'm of course being sarcastic, but this is deep, right? The idea that science may prescind itself from politics and be objective, like the idea that there is a truth. Of course, we've just seen that in communism there are truths depending on the season, on the weather, right? Could not exist. Communist authorities would see it as a counter-revolutionary deviation. In the idea that there is a truth in the world in which we live in, and that this has nothing to do with our poor gnoseological means, right? And nobody owns the truth, but that something that we can't grow closer to that, or that there is a truth in the first place. This is a deviation against revolution. So radical moral relativism and subjectivism, that is not to say, like, I have an opinion and I have another, let's see what we can do to find out what is true. No, this concept did not exist. There is no such thing like the option in the Soviet Union or in any other communist regime. There is no such thing. You have to cancel it from your mind. It does not exist. You have never heard of it. You don't even know what it means. And you know what this means? What happened to scientists in the Soviet Union? You know what happened to Vasiliev and other biologists? Well, since they had, acknowledged at the time that there were things like hereditarity and innate disposition in genetics, they were sent to Siberia. So the idea that you could even inherit like a biological character that would affect your mind was impossible, was irreconcilable with the concept of the communist man. It was seen as an amorphous substance that could just take the shape of the environment that determined it. Class, and basically it, because that's basically what they all cared about. So Marxism could not accept it, right? I don't know if you ever read the Communist Manifesto, but how can you like there are not even, you see, when you read these things, you think there is a logical cogent point that you get from A to B. Here it's just basically the statement that you belong, that there are just classes, and that you don't even explain what they are and why they form, and what there is a broader historical, political, and social process, or whether they even exist. No, they just exist. So you're just determined by that, and you as a human being has no meaning. Class has a meaning. Humanity doesn't. So this was, again, irreconcilable with communism. The idea of humanity itself, even from a biological point of view, in its individuality, was inconceivable. In other words, what you get, which was not even a communist idea, was just hypothesized at some point in the West, and was engineered by the communists, and thus was, and the properly evolutionary materialism. So without any kind of spiritual dimension, right, of properly the idea that you can make a difference just with your mind, or that there is something that you cannot control in somebody's mind, that it is out there, that we don't even factually know what it is still today scientifically. And it makes basically the world magic done. And sociological scientism, so pretending that fundamentally there is a fixed principle in any political social reality within which you can rigidly frame everything with full certainty, and This is, of course, the base of the official view of the state, in communist regimes, resulting in a, of course, as a consequence, in a complete brainwashing of the of everybody, right? Of the new generations that, of course, don't even know anything except from it. And don't think that today we're that different. Whenever we see that, things like cultural Marxism exist in our society, and don't think that they are less because they are just cultural Marxists. So probably, some of the most radically undereducated people you can find. I mean, before the word real communists, right? Big news, by the way. If you can't speak German or Russian, you're not a communist by definition, because if you can't read Marx and Lenin, I wonder what the hell you're even talking about. And no, translations are not enough, because there are certain concepts in German and Russian that you can't quite translate, like if you don't know the language in itself and what the whole subtleties of the various dogmas that emerge from it are actually based upon, right? So but the inherent risk stands in the moral collapse of society, because even if you have just a pseudo intellectual imbecile like the average woke I don't know, social justice word now is not even a trendy anymore, right? The term is just whatever. I don't even want to qualify them. You can indoctrinate a bunch of empty-brained people just that easily, because of course they do not have any cultural resistance. They don't have any morality or scientificity to oppose to this bullshit, right? So most people think they are something. They don't even know what it means, right? And surely people living there at least knew what it meant on their skin. So of course, we know that all this comes with anti-religion, right? That is, it's not mere atheism per se, right? It's a rather a counter-religion, right? It's taking all these ideas as essentially a fixed body of that is completely substitutive of any other view or belief, right? And that betray what was probably at the root of Bolshevism, that seen as the great disease of the West, because this eventually came into the paranoid phraseology of communism. What, according to you? Faith, right? The need to believe was, of course, destroyed, because anything that, of course, was pertaining in a totalizing sense, like religion, to those universal values that were inherent in, as we know, basically from any scientific field that we know, from evolutionary biology to psychology to anthropology to history, anything is needed in the hierarchies that we have created. This world, in the history of civilization, would collapse. I mean, what a better mean to make that collapse by cutting at the root what keeps them up, that is properly faith and belief, right? This was properly cancelled, because you see, it was not faith and belief in something alternative. It was properly the destruction of the concept of faith and belief, right? Because these imply that you have to make a willing individual conscious effort to embrace an idea and to struggle to understand it, to search, to strive for it. This world package, this world concept was completely eradicated from any Soviet reality. It could not exist, because it was not an option. It could not exist, right? The idea that you could have things like feelings, the idea that you would think of a better world that you could make on your own, this was completely eliminated, right? The idea of being just owning something, having feelings, even love in an actual sense, right? The passions broadly meant, right? Had to be all eliminated. And the purpose of this all, of course, was to level any class difference, right? There is nothing but proletarians, not even, because as we'll see now, in the concept of family wasn't really tolerated as such. as a, within the scale, there couldn't be properly such scale of values. It would have been of no use. It would have been just hampering the machine. A machine that fundamentally had leveled any kind of difference, any properly immoral in material terms alike. You know how this was achieved. I'm not going to talk about that, but I presume every person who has successfully concluded primary education must know forcefully. The creation properly, this managed to impose essentially a technocratic control in a totalitarian fashion. So it was just this big state apparatus, nothing else. Next move, what do? You level sexes, right? Was complete equality of men and women achieved in the Soviet Union? Well, let's say the Soviet Union never really achieved fully anything as such, but yes, the concept, the idea of communism at least, was to eliminate any difference between men and women. For what purpose? Because they cared about men, or cared about women, they cared about sexes. Men and women were all completely equal, because they were all completely worthless. You were just comrade. Thus, nothing like manhood or womanhood were conceived. And this is just, by the way, spending. I don't make so-called. I don't, as you know, I don't have feministic or masculistic inclinations in this sense. But I would like to remind the enormous effort and again, completely wasted, or practically almost completely wasted, of Soviet women, right, in the Union working force, right, treated as utter nothing. Working as men, and plus being mothers, and having to deal with that, of course, in a world where you're stripped of any human dignity. We have to raise children when you're stripped of any human dignity is not really, you're, yes, perfect equality in nothingness, all equal in complete misery. And of course, also family in this sense doesn't have any meaning, because, we're not talking about family, the strong, powerful concept of manhood and womanhood in an archetypical, heroic sense, like in the traditional one, but also in the lame, cheap, decadent one of the bourgeois period, right? There were these, a big change properly in the redefinition of what the civil status was in the Soviet Union. And of course, remember that education is totally in the hands of the state, right? So the purpose of Soviet education is to indoctrinate children to prefer the collective life over the family one, because it's more important, right? Family one is not even, they don't even exist. Like, of course, Soviet people lived with families. There was a continuities into it, but, this was nothing in the moment they entered essentially what every adult has to enter into in a life. You're just framed within a machine. You're just, you're not even framed. Like, you are a part of the machine and you work in function of the machine. You as such are useless, are perfectly replaceable. And people were replaced. So, aside from this disconcerting realities, but there was properly a broader sense of community that was redefined altogether, right? For example, that this was the debate between internationalism and, for example, a Soviet, like if you were at least in the first constitution of the Soviet Union, a foreigner who was recognized as a proletarian worker would be essentially welcomed in the Soviet Union, would become a Soviet, cent per cent, right? Just like any other. Whereas, say, a Russian, for example, if he was not a proletarian worker, was excluded from the Soviet Union to court. Right? Most people were, killed, deported, right? They were, however, denaturalized properly. They didn't belong to the place, to the country, because such a thing properly even didn't exist anymore, right? So they were basically outcasts, and they wouldn't have any. This is the other point. They weren't recognized any juridical personality, right? So this is like quite interesting situation. You living in your own country where you've always been living, you basically lose any right. The first person with nothing that arrives from nowhere, with no particular talents or capacity or progress or education, whatever, comes and becomes a full citizen like you, just to work as a slave, right? And not like you, because in this case the example was that you were not basically a proletarian, but in case you were a proletarian, by the way, you would get this whole thing. So of course, this again with internationalism, the change for practical reasons, they were quite practical, because you know that Trotsky was for exporting the revolution in every state. This was the idea of the world revolution, of the fourth estate triumphing everywhere. Russia would have been just, the country in which this thing had been born, or at least in the sense that, the proletariat would have allegedly taken over, and that had to be exported. Eventually, the Soviet Union came to overlap for essentially because it was not powerful enough. This is the whole story of the Cold War. At the same point, even if they interfere, of course, will lower the war, but they properly didn't have the power to achieve fundamentally much. It's like nuclear weapons came in the scene. So with that, you can achieve a big deal without having qualitative standards for that matter. But let's say properly from a political, strategical point of view in the world at the time, the Soviet Union would better consolidate, if anything, threatening the neighboring countries, imposing its power, but let's say mostly and largely overlapping what had been the Tsarist empire, which is not the same thing, by the way. Like, it's true that there was a big deal of Russian imperialism living in the veins of the Soviet Union, but it's not even properly quite the same thing with Tsarism, of course, but even properly with Russia only. Right. And what is fascinating of this, though, is this, quite perverse idea that fundamentally there was almost a messianic, in fact, promise, right, where God was substituted with the idea of the collectivized man, literally the God-carrying people in some external exemplificative definition, let's say, that would, essentially it was predestined to work a sort of universal redemption in socialism all over the world. And so this was a radical idea, of course, that was abandoned by the same Soviet Union for quite concrete reasons, because again they couldn't, but that never remained, was always, however, consumed within. This was true also here, like in other countries, like in the West, where you had communist parties, etc. This was the idea of the Soviet Union as the glorious home of, where the starting point of the socialist revolution and so on. But of course, just reality showing you very different things. Not just because the blocks as such did not exist, but of course because, mostly, but people didn't even know concretely what life in the Soviet Union was sometimes. Like most Westerners, yes, traveled, they could go there, tourism, but let's say the average, in fact, proletarian that worked in the West, like they just heard, they wouldn't travel, they heard, well, how was the Soviet Union? They fooled themselves. It was anything, positive for that matter, and owning a completely different mindset from what, of course, the one that they knew nothing about what actual Soviet people had, given the appalling conditions in which they dwelled. So, but this messianic promise was still weaponized as a sort of justification for interfering in other countries in the rest of the world, as you know, during the same Cold War, and subulating the revolution in other countries that, of course, the Soviets didn't give a damn about in the first place, but still were to act internationally against the West and so on. So what is fascinating about this is also the relation with the revolution, right? The concept is that the revolution now belonged to the past, right? Every idea, and still today, largely, if you speak with people from the country, they tell you that that they're horrified by the concept of revolution. Like, nobody actually likes the idea, because again, people are traumatized, justifiably. They distrust anything. They just want everything to be maintained. This is yet another very useful idea. The idea that the revolution was a struggle, like it's also like World War II, something that must never happen again, but that in practice, what actually means is that let's leave the government do whatever the hell they want, so that we are told we have this minimal, servile attitude, the sense of, we are secure because, is this the right way to do it? This is, of course, the typically psychological attitude of, traumatized, paranoid personalities that were scientifically engineered by the Soviet government. And this is important because the entire history of the Soviet Union was a constant indoctrination in this sense. Like, it was never a phase, like a moment and another things. It was exclusively about this concept. It's so much that it still lives today. Right, so totalitarianism, the best option in the mind of the Soviet, because kind of revolution is bad, right? It's chaos, it's disorder. Now instead we have it, we got it, we are the right one. Yes, the rest of the world is evil. Yes, but we are better, right? And so this is the problem, that the communist state becomes the only engine of the community. Like, there is properly no entrepreneuriality, no individuality, no enterprise, no autonomy of any sort. This is paradoxical because, there were, of course, also in the Soviet Union, some kind of, A, B class citizens, also based on the enormous amount of ethnicities that exist. And you have something that, while, many Russians were, for example, maintained by social means, who were appallingly, poor, nothing, but let's say somebody else living in the wild, like the Mongols, I don't know. It turns out today, in the Russian Federation, in many ways, that since they had always to kind of survive on their own, they have a much more entrepreneurial mindset, and they are much more successful in many instances than the ethnic Russians at some levels, right? In some situations, this is especially true in Siberia and these areas where still those, the ethnic divides are more evident and by scale. But let's say, so the more you go west, the more you find civilization. But the idea is that this sense properly of autonomy, the idea that you can improve yourself, was completely cancelled from the mindset, right? It's still something you see today. The idea, why don't you self-improve yourself? Well, because everybody should be like they are. Why? Like, are you satisfied how the world goes? Well, what value do you give to, your own human potential to say everything should be the way it is? Because they have been properly inculcated that everything is fine. You should never question anything about the differences of the world. It's dangerous. People can come and take you away if you do, right? So, in this sense, in this big communist state machine, the individual is just a lever or a cog, right? And so the mere concept of human life is, what is it? Is nothing, right? So, and consequently, any infamy is allowed. any crime, any terror. Right? What is dreadful about, I don't know, in Nazi Germany, you see the perpetrators of genocide were just, were safe. They had a job, they did that. Nobody would come and do anything to them. In Stalinist terror, nobody was safe. Like, it's not that if you were a part of the state, they were always, you were safe or anything. They were always essentially competing and spying on each other and betraying each other and having them deported for the minimal suspicion. Stalin was the first victim in the sense of Stalinist propaganda, because everybody was servilely, struggling to stand out, to be perfect, and to betray others. As you see, I spot the insane element, the sick element of our, this is a bourgeois, this is just an individualist who wants to destroy. Let's take him out or support him in Siberia. This is literally how the thing worked. But this is pretty much unknown. I mean, I presume you don't think that. I don't know, read a very balanced, I don't know, it's plenty of historiography on Soviet, but I don't know, if you want to find a very neutral one, it also highlights some positive. Look at the, what's that? I think it's the Soviet, it's the Cambridge History of the Soviet Union, right? It's a nice, quick read for beginners. But this is like it's not being hidden. It's not ideologized. It seems to me that people today live in a sense that everybody's lying to them, even in the West. Like in the West, we have everything. You can study everything. You can look at everything. There is no conspiracy. If you think so, it's because you are degenerating exactly in the same way in this regime, in the conditions that had allowed these regimes to take over in the first place. So, because you see, there is nothing here that you can do outside of the mechanism. If you pretend, you will be swept away and broken by the gears of the machine. Because everybody's waiting for you to screw up and to fail. You will be deported together with your whole family. So matter and spirit, because you cannot really cancel spirit from a person unless it's dead. So everything was perfectly enrolled into the common effort. Right? So there was no escape. You were trained to do that. This is the worst about totalitarian regimes, that you are trained to willingly do this. Because you never lose your will. You just bend it to an external center of gravity that is not you. Because you fear. And you don't fear because you're a poor hero, that is just doing it for the fame. You fear because you have been properly stripped of any dignity since birth, because you don't know what any moral value based on a civilizational level or a spiritual sense or an historical sense actually is. You don't even know what science is. You don't know what the world is. Hence you're weak and cowardly, because that's exactly how you have been designed to be as an object by these regimes. And so this is the thing, that the Soviet Union was an entire bloc that didn't leave anything outside of itself. Like, there is not a traditional organic ideal where you have, various communities participating and cooperating and struggling to make things, to build things, to make it work and to keep together this miracle that there are civic education, democratic values, and individual empowerment and human rights, and the idea that you can always become a better, more powerful person and do more from which others can benefit as you flourish individually and thanks to your effort. The only thing that exists in the Soviet Union is the state. It's everything. It's more than a state, actually, because it owns the trust. It owns, what would be the equivalent of a church, by the way. So the entire political, ideological, economical, industrial system, it's all the state. This is very common because they say, you don't have to think about anything here. Right, look at what we have created. Now work, or you and your family will disappear from the face of the earth. Right, so this is a subversion of any healthy human community, right? So what is deep about this that you can see in other totalitarian regimes, but not in this fashion, really, as a dynamic, but not in the same direction, is that there is a sort of cathartic moment, an ascetic moment in Soviet communism. It's the idea that after all, this world work gets down to achieving absolute reality, right? So it's devoid of anything that is seen as a distraction in individualistic or humanistic terms. You see interior reality for what it is. The problem is that this is impersonal, and it is impersonal in the sense that it doesn't work for, freeing yourself from your own limitation. It works towards your involution. It's not about cultivating yourself. You see, the Nazis had the myth of, super-homism, right? As insane as it was in the especially in the purpose that they wanted to achieve, and it was again just fueled by the lowest echelons of ethno-nationalism. It was not a qualitative, aristocratic, traditional value. It was, just convincing absolutely mediocre people to be special because they were born in a country, right? This is the concept. In the Soviet Union, this worked towards the subpersonal direction. That is to say, you had to properly despoil yourself of any individuality of any kind. So there is no... You see, the neurocognitive damage to this is that you don't see reality, anything anymore, as something you can positively construct yourself, but that you are basically enslaved and subjugated by. You're not freeing yourself at all. You're basically enslaving yourself in the process. So this, of course, was achieved in the most brutal forms by simply purging everybody who had any kind of quality, starting from the kulakis or the previous Tsarist officers, the Russian army, every intellect, any quality, people, I've seen also scientists, every people who had a real quality, right? People who were educated, who were intelligent, who were experienced. Yes, okay, we're talking about Russia of the, people born in the late 19th, in the early 20th century. I mean, as we've seen, the Tsarist regime was nothing, special in terms of where you would like to be, but it was still a world that, after all, was striving to change and to hopefully change for the better, and you would have needed those people, right? Everybody knows what were the damages, for example, of the army purges under Stalin. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers killed for no reason. The Nazis basically almost overrunning the entire Soviet Union as a process, and part of the reason why the Soviet Union made it is that also they were habituated from the deportations and the forced labor, all these things, to just shift millions of people literally from a place to another without, and that's an obscure part of history about which we don't even know how many people died in the process. Like, they were just objects, it's like you ship, I don't know, animals or something. Like, it doesn't matter. There are so many, by the way. That was also another thing, the demographic aspect. But this is the entire deal of the Soviet Union. It is essentially the triumph of the fourth state, that is, of the lowest form of human potential as adult, mature beings, to be enslaved under the guidance of one of the single most ferocious, horrifying, and shameful regimes in the history of mankind, to achieve nothing, to achieve what we see today, that is half of Europe still suffering structurally and dramatically from severe moral and material abjection, and still here not caring because of that, because whoever cares, like, this thinks it's past. What's the past? What's history? what did happen is, who cares? No, we're fine, really. We're cool. No, it's just the Americans telling lies. It's all you fell for it, and yeah, yeah, and yeah, and I think I will keep talking about this because I'm taking a liking to it. Never done it, but this is just saying a bunch of things about the Soviet Union. And as I said in between, and I repeat this is a universal message. Because Soviet doesn't mean Russian, doesn't mean anything specific. Because it's a denial of humanity and of the dignity of mankind in the first place. So what is happening in these hours and what is happening will keep happening, right? This has nothing to do with where you come from or what were the preconditions in where you were born or what we were raised into, but how much you can do now where it's most needed. And I can't salute you like the other times today, but I can tell you so that anytime you hear somebody talking about the decommunization, whatever the term was, the denazification thing, the reconstruction of the Soviet Union, creation of countries by the Soviets, all these things, remember what the Soviet Union was. And long live free Ukraine.